Good evening. I'm Jim Lara, and I'm in New York again tonight while Robin is away. Back in Washington today, the House Rules Committee approved full subpoena powers for an Ethics Committee investigation of that famous leak of the Pike Committee intelligence report, otherwise known as the Daniel Shore affair. If the full House now goes along with that request, a full-fledged investigation could get underway, an action which could include the subpoenaing of Shore himself. Shore, as you know, is the CBS reporter who made a copy of the Pike report available for publication in the Village Voice, a weekly newspaper published here in New York. The House had voted to keep that report secret, and the whole business has touched off a real furor. Shore's job at CBS may be in jeopardy. The FBI is already trying to find out who gave the report to Shore, and soon that House committee may be going after the same thing. It is possible that the House could even hold Shore in contempt of Congress and jerk his congressional press pass. It will probably be weeks, though, before all of that is resolved. In the meantime, Shore's action and his troubles have set off a frantic debate, both within the government and the journalism business. And tonight we want to consider some of the central questions that have emerged from this Shore affair. First, on the journalism side, Neil Sheehan is with us in Washington. He's a former correspondent in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. He's the man who secured and then reported on the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Mr. Sheehan, journalists seem to be coming down on both sides of this issue on the ethical question. What are the basic ethical questions involved in what Daniel Shore did?
Well, basically, what Mr. Shore has done in terms of giving out a report for publication is in consonance with normal journalistic ethics. There's nothing wrong with giving something to the Village Voice to publish. Mr. Shore may have violated the corporate rules of CBS, in which case he's in trouble with his own employer.
Well, Mr. Sheehan, that journalists, newspaper editorial writers do not agree with that is the basic journalism position that what Dan Shore did is right. I mean, there is debate going on within newsrooms all over the country. You would concede that, would you not?
I would concede there is debate, but I would also say that the people who say Dan Shore didn't have a right to give that report to the Village Voice and the Village Voice didn't have a right to publish it really don't know what they're talking about in terms of what they do themselves. The New York Times, for example, publishes foreign news, at least 50% of which is classified, that is secret by the standards of the executive branch. There's no difference between Congress voting not to publish something and the executive branch classifying it. First Amendment doesn't give Congress any right to keep something out of public print any more than it does the executive branch.
But from an individual working press standpoint, Mr. Sheehan, does the question that's been raised that Shore was not functioning as a professional journalist in the Village Voice transaction, he was functioning as a trafficker in state secrets?
That's nonsense. All newspapers in this country traffic in state secrets. So do all the television networks and the radio networks. If you label a state secret something that's classified. Mm-hmm. The fact is that the basic information in that report had been published in the New York Times on the 20th, long before it appeared in the Village Voice. And the fact that Congress voted to keep it secret doesn't mean that anyone has to keep it secret.
Well,
the congressional vote doesn't carry any more weight than a classification by the executive branch. Right, Mr. Shore was not trying to make money in the matter. He was seeking glory. He's egocentric, and he's abrasive, and he's unpopular within the community of journalists, which is one of the reasons why he's in trouble.
But you don't think there's a serious question on the other side?
I don't really think there is, no. I don't think Mr. Shore was trafficking in state secrets any more than anyone else does.
All right, sir, thank you. Charles Morgan is an attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union. He's been involved in many First Amendment cases on the side of the press. Mr. Morgan, is this a First Amendment case?
Sure, clearly, quintessentially a freedom of the press issue. You were talking a moment ago and chatting about some folks within the news organizations debating the question. That debate exists primarily between those who write editorials and those who report. Those who write editorials talk about leaks. Those who report talk about informed sources.
How could this be a First Amendment case when there has been no talk at all of taking the Village Voice to task for publishing it, no talk of taking CBS to task for carrying the reports that Shore made based on the report? I mean, there's been no question here of freedom of the press. The information was out, et cetera.
Congress shall make no law is what the First Amendment says. If there's ever been a case where Congress is trying to make some law, this is it. They've already voted to investigate Shore. Today they're attempting to vote the subpoena power. Tomorrow, $300,000, who knows what. Those are laws. Congress shall make no law respecting the freedom of the press in this country.
Okay, well, do you think...
I mean, no law means no law, and that's what it is.
But aren't you interpreting the First Amendment rather loosely, that the First Amendment...
That's what we call strict construction, the strictest. No law means no law.
That a journalist can literally do anything in terms of getting information out.
He can publish, you're darn tootin' he can.
But Daniel Shore did publish in terms of CBS, and that's not what they're upset with him
Well,
about.
Daniel Shore, perhaps he did offer it to CBS, perhaps he didn't. I don't know the details of that. I assume that he did, and then he offered it to someone else, and they published it. The man's free to publish. You know, we're talking about a very boring report to begin with. Mm-hmm. There's no information in it much. It resulted from a cover-up investigation in a cover-up Congress. So what we're really talking about is kind of a fictional issue posed by Gerald Ford and the CIA to go on the offensive after all of the reports of assassinations and shellfish toxin and cobra venom and whatever else they do for a living out there. I mean, what kind of, that bunch of thugs.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. We'll come back to that. All right. Within the government, of course, there's also an uproar over this whole Shore affair. And with us here in New York is Sam Adams, and he was an analyst and official with the Central Intelligence Agency for 10 years. Mr. Adams, the administration and some members of Congress and others have charged that the Pike Committee report represents, or the publication of the Pike Committee reports represents a threat to our national security. Well, from the point of view of a government official who was involved at one time from keeping government secrets secret, what's at stake in this Shore affair?
Let me not use the Shore report, but to pose a general question. Does a government, the U.S. government in this case, have the right to keep secrets during peacetime? And again, not using the Shore report, let me give another example, a much clearer one.
You don't like my question, that's all right.
A much clearer one.
Right.
At one time, the CIA was bugging the phone in the limousine belonging to Brezhnev. This fact was leaked to the press, to Jack Anderson. And it seems to me one question that springs to my mind: ought the government pass a law to prevent a leak like this? Now, as to the Shore case, it seems to me...
Now, what are you saying there? You saying they should pass a law to prevent a leak like that?
I happen to think that a law should be passed to prevent a leak like that, not to nail Jack Anderson, who happened to be the recipient of that. To
protect the... We want to later on in the program talk about some specific proposals that have been made along that line. But back to the Shore case.
Back to the Shore case. Now, it seems to me that Shore has violated no statute that I've ever heard of by accepting material from a government official who felt he wanted to leak it. And I simply can't fault Shore on that account, and wouldn't.
Okay. All right, let's go for an additional point of view now, back to Washington, to Mitchell Rogovin. Mr. Rogovin is a Washington attorney and the special counsel to the Director of Central Intelligence. He's a former Assistant Attorney General of the United States and Chief Counsel to the Internal Revenue Service. Mr. Rogovin, you've heard a lot of points of view thus far on this. Let me tell you what Mr. Shore has said. He says the real issue in this case is whether Congress can forbid the publication of information that has already escaped its control. What do you think? Do you think that's the central issue? If not, what do you think it is?
I think the whole thing has been blown out of proportion. The issue that I see is the press biting at the behind of Daniel Shore. The central question, as I think Neil pointed out, was that this material was published on the 20th of January, the first story in the New York Times. On the 26th of January, the New York Times, again, in great detail, reported as to what the draft of the House Select Committee report had to say. And subsequently, Dan Shore, on his radio broadcast and on television, reported the materials. So if we're interested in secrecy and If the government was going to come down like the ogre that Mr. Morgan seems to believe it is, then that was the time to move. No action took place. The House then voted on in a very strange fashion. The issue arose as to whether that committee's report would be made public or not. And that was a simple question of a committee having made an agreement with the President of the United States and not keeping it. And by almost 2-to-1 margin, the House voted that they should not publish the report until, and the until is important, until the issues of classification have been worked out by the President.
And Shore already had a copy of it at that time,
Sure.
at the time of the vote.
Sure.
He'd been given it earlier.
Now, the issue really, if there's an issue, is who gave the report to apparently the New York Times and to Dan Shore and possibly other papers. And there the only legitimate question that I can see is who on the committee staff, what member of the committee, or what member of the executive branch made the material available. And I think that the House, the committee, and the executive branch has a right to expect fidelity from its employees. And if you voluntarily undertake a job that has a requirement of secrecy, I think the employer has every right to try to seek some redress when that's violated. And that's the only... Shore simply has become a public focal point, I think primarily by the press for their own reasons.
Why?
Well, I think Neil put his finger on it. Dan Shore is a very aggressive reporter, and for reasons best known to his own network and to the rest of the press, they've seemed to focus on him. Now, the easy way to run an investigation is to ask Dan Shore who gave it to you, with a predictable result that he will refuse. And so you get in a contempt situation. But I think the last thing that you would do would be to ask Dan Shore. The first thing you would do would be to ask the members of the committee, the members of the committee staff, the people in the executive branch who had access to the report, and see if you can't find out what happened to that report from that approach.
Do you think there would be such a flap over this matter if it did not involve Congress, if it was, say, an executive branch report of some kind?
Well, you know, the answer is easy, no, because it had been out since the 20th of January.
No, but I mean just in general terms. The fact that Congress is catching it this time, it was their report, so they're raising more cane about it than they would have, obviously, if it had been a state secret from the executive branch.
Well, there's a possibility. That may have some impact.
Yeah. Well, look, let's move aside now, as you started to do a minute ago, Mr. Adams, from the specifics of the Shore case to some of the major issues that have been raised, maybe incorrectly in the context of the Shore case. But let's examine some of them. First of them is the one that you raised a moment ago, Mr. Adams. Who should decide what the public has a right to know? The government or the individual journalist? Mr. Sheehan?
Well, I would say that both should decide. That's been the system for really 200 years, and it's worked very, very well. I think the government, and I would include Congress, should try to keep what secrets it thinks it ought to keep. And I think the press ought to have a right, as well as any other citizen, to publish whatever secrets it thinks the public ought to know. Now, this sets up a system of conflict which sometimes leads to abuse. And the instance Mr. Adams cited may very well be a case of abuse. I really don't know in that case. But there have been instances where material has been abused. However, basically, I think the country benefits from this system. It's benefited from it even prior to the Revolution, when Benjamin Franklin leaked some documents showing that the governor of Massachusetts intended to suppress liberties, for which he was praised by those in favor of independence from England and attacked by the Royalists. Yeah, so I think the system works very well as it is.
You like the system, Mr. Morgan?
Well, I like the system much better than what's being proposed. I think that the government has no right to secrets in peacetime. I would not say that. I think the government will keep secrets no matter what law you pass, just as government officials will lie. The lying becomes a major civil liberties and constitutional question in that in a democracy such as ours, unlike a kingdom or a sheikdom or a bunch of shahs, we have a right to educate the people and a duty to. And the people vote on the government. With government secrets, covert activities require cover stories. Cover stories lead to cover-ups. Cover stories is another way of saying lies. We happen to think, and I think, that our only national security is the truth, And the present system that we have is reporters go and try to get it. But far too many people in government cover up, and the rule of a government is to cover up. Mr. Rogovin mentioned the fidelity to keep agreements to, for the president to say, I have a right to secrets, and you can have the secret if you keep the secret. And then for the president to tell the people who's got the agreement from about his illegal conduct. And then for that person who got that agreement, who's not a lawyer for the CIA and who's not a priest or a doctor, to keep that secret. Seems to me like that's a classic definition of cover-up. A lawyer and a congressman's got an obligation to tell the people, his constituents.
Mr. Rogovin, how do you respond to that?
I think it's a simple matter. I think that industry starts off, take any of the large corporations that have trademarks, have trade secrets, have chemical formulas that they're using. They place a responsibility on the employee. If the employee doesn't want to work under those conditions, then he seeks employment elsewhere. But it is impossible, from my point of view, to see how a country can maintain secrets without having some control over the employees. The employees should not have to test their standards day in and day out by the requests of reporters for a bit of information. Tell me the secrets you know. To me, if the man doesn't want to work under those conditions, and they're arduous conditions, no question about it, then he should seek employment elsewhere. But I don't see this as a First Amendment issue. I think the First Amendment issue comes into play if the press becomes the victim, if they become a potential defendant in these circumstances. That's not what the issue is about at all. The issue is whether the government has the right to have a very limited statute requiring that sources and methods, it's a very, very simple and select strain of classified information to be secret.
All right, that brings us right into a discussion of the legislation that's now been proposed, because there's already been a lot of talk that the backlash from the Shore case could result in a tough anti-leaking law of some sort. And in fact, President Ford has recently proposed legislation that would make it a serious crime for government employees to leak some kinds of classified information to the press, as Mr. Rogovin has just been commenting on. Or in fact, under the president's proposal, leaking certain information to Congress would also be subject to this law. And journalists who reported the information could conceivably be asked to reveal their sources to grand juries investigating the leaks or be held in contempt. Okay, Mr. Rogovin, I take it that you feel that some kind of law like this is called for?
Yeah, I think it's a desirable means of maintaining the importance of secrets. And you have to start with the proposition that there really are secrets. And what we're talking about is the type of thing that the Fourth Circuit found to be appropriate, an agreement between an employee and an employer, or a contract. The Fourth Circuit said it had nothing to do with the First Amendment. It was simply a question of an agreement that someone entered into at the time of employment. And when he decided to write a book about the secrets of the CIA, the court enjoined certain portions of that book as being in violation of the written contract that had been entered into.
You're talking about Marchetti,
right.
Marchetti Mark's book. Mr. Morgan, how do you feel about this proposal?
Well, if the government has a right to keep secrets, we disagree on that, of course. I don't think the government has a right to keep secrets.
No secrets at all?
Not in peacetime. Of course not. They work for you. You don't want folks working for you keeping secrets from you. That's crazy. A man's out of his mind to do that. Secondly, we're also a little bit...
What about the example Mr. Adams used a moment ago?
About Brezhnev's automobile? You don't wiretap Mr. Brezhnev's automobile because you don't have wiretappers in Russia. When you get rid of the wiretappers in Russia, you don't have to worry about that sort of thing. Okay. Fire the spies, because spies lead to lies. The government of the United States lies to the citizens of the United States. I'm not worried about Angola and places, Vietnam. I'm worried about what's happened here. Let me give you an example. Okay. We just paid $800. What are these sources and methods Mr. Rogovin's talking about? Well, the methods to get the sources are bribery, burglary, blackmail, extortion. $800,000 paid to the chief of the Italian police, or whoever he was. Well, that just leads to $8 million paid to a Japanese war criminal by Lockheed, or another $1 million paid to a former SS agent over in Holland, if that be the case. Now, all I know is that it corrupts this society.
And I take it then, is it a fair assumption that you do not think there should be a law to prosecute people who leak government documents?
I don't even believe that there is such a thing as a leak of a government document. I believe those documents belong to the people in peacetime. And the cost of them, it just costs us too much.
Mr. Adams, where do you come down on this?
I think I'd probably come down squarely on the side of Mr. Rogovin on such a thing. And since Japan was mentioned by Mr. Morgan, I might use another example of a secret that I think is worth keeping. Before I mentioned the fact that the CIA at one time was tapping Brezhnev's limousine's phone. Before World War II, the United States government broke some Japanese codes. Eventually, the breaking of these codes gave us a great deal of information which allowed us, during World War II, when later warfare broke out, gave us a great deal of information, and I think it was very important to our winning the war, even though it was initially obtained during peacetime. Now, I think that this kind of secret, the breaking of a Japanese code, the bugging of Brezhnev's limousine, is worth keeping.
What about Mr. Rogovin's position that that the law should be made part of essentially an employment contract, that you, as an employee of the CIA, when you go to work for the CIA, you sign a contract which says, I will never reveal any information, etc., classified information, and that if you do, either while you're an employee or after you leave employment of the CIA, you can be prosecuted under the criminal statutes, which is essentially what this law recommends. Would you be in favor of that?
I think I'd have to waffle on that particular item. To start off with, I happen to be writing a book on intelligence material. And I did, incidentally, in writing an article, for example, for Harper's, I did submit it to the CIA as I was required to by a contract which I signed early on as I joined the CIA. Now, I had no objection to signing the contract. In fact, I had no objection to submitting the article to the CIA. In fact, the CIA passed the darn thing without a word being changed. However, I would have to be very careful in seeing how the law is drafted later on, how stiff the criminal penalty would be.
Mr. Rogovin.
Yes, sir.
I saw you shaking your head, et cetera, at some things that were said. You can speak. You can do
Oh,
more
okay.
than shake your head.
Okay, well, I really wanted to point out that the statute that's proposed is limited. The criminal sanctions are limited to the revealing of sources or methods information, not any and all classified information that ever came to the hands of an employee. And sources or methods are as I said, a limited strain, and the statute has a very tight control over how prosecutions may be brought. And I think that once the statute is, in its proposed form, is made public, the debate can focus on that, and the discussions can join issue on that narrow framework, and not the whole question of prosecuting someone who works for the government who reveals a classified bit of information.
Mr. Sheehan, how do you feel? Well, can the press accept a new secrets law that's been proposed by the president, or one similar to that?
I don't think the press can. I would disagree with Mr. Adams and Mr. Rogovin on this. As I understand the legislation the president's proposing, any government employee or any employee of a government contractor who had received information which was allegedly relating to intelligence sources and information could, if he or she disclosed that information to any unauthorized person, be punished by 5 years in jail or $5,000 fine or both. Now, I have a suspicion from my own experience with the Nixon administration that were such a law passed, first of all, the government prosecutors would have a statute through which they could proceed. The language, namely information relating to intelligence sources and methods is really so broad and so vague. It could be brought to bear on almost anything in terms of material like the Pentagon Papers, Watergate material, material that's published every day on the front pages of papers, because that concerns methods and sometimes it concerns sources. That is, it can be claimed that the publication of the material discloses the source or discloses the method.
Well,
and I think with that kind of weapon, reporters would find themselves subpoenaed to grand juries, or they would find themselves witnesses in proceedings, and we would have, in effect, an Official Secrets Act in this country. I don't see any reason to change the current system. I think the government should have the right, which it now has, to discipline its own employees by firing them or demoting them or failing to promote them. We live in a pluralistic society with a great deal of tension. And the ironic thing of the Shore controversy, for example, to illustrate this, is that men of Mr. Stratton's political persuasion, Mr. Stratton, who's heading that subcommittee, were in my day, when I was covering the Pentagon for the Times in the 60s, not Mr. Stratton himself, but men of his political persuasion were the best leakers I had. I discovered that the Southern conservatives were the guys who would hand you a classified document, the original, with the red stamp still on it, saying secret. And I think that this kind of law would be invidious. It would destroy the First Amendment.
Mr. Adams, you wanted to...
I'd sort of have to ask not the rhetorical, but the specific question is, how do you nail a guy who leaks the fact that we're bugging Brezhnev's phone? You fire him? Is that good enough?
Well, let's go further. 95% of the intelligence that we have, as the CIA says, comes from satellite submarines and public sources. What we've done is we've developed a $10 billion secret clandestine budget in this country. We've even infiltrated the press and reporters. One good newspaper reporter, Mr. Sheehan in Russia, who knew officials as he did Southern conservatives, of which he is not one, could report to all the people of the United States fairly and quite freely.
All right, gentlemen, I want to thank you, the two of you in Washington and you gentlemen here in New York. Robin is attending a public television conference on public affairs programming in California, and he will not be back until Thursday, so I will be seeing you again tomorrow night. Until then, I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.